Hi, I'm Brian Jacobs. I'm a student at North Seattle College doing the Nano program, and I'm doing a presentation for you on wolves, why we fear them and why we should love them. Human beings and wolves have been in conflict for over 10,000 years. When we were hunter-gatherers, they competed with us for prey, and when we became farmers and agriculturists, they predated upon our livestock and flocks. And wolves are incredible hunters.
But the big alpha male is not distracted. He's got a lock on his prey.
Here we see a single alpha male wolf bring down a 600-pound bison yearling calf. So we've always had this antagonistic relationship with wolves. But there's also something else that we think about wolves. We consider them to be actually evil. And there's a reason for that. In the Middle Ages, all over Europe and Asia, rabies was very prevalent. And so I feel that it's because of the disease that we associate with wolves more than any other animal that we fear and hate wolves. And rabies is a very terrible disease. Once the symptoms start to show, there is absolutely no cure. The person who has rabies becomes agitated, becomes aggressive, attacks the people who care for him or her, and suffers an agonizing, tormented death. And it's perhaps this that gave us the legend of the werewolf, a person bitten by a wolf who turns into a werewolf and then attacks other people, and then anyone who's attacked by the werewolf is also turned themselves into a werewolf. And this also applies to another animal, the bat. So we associate the bat with vampires. And the bat also carries rabies. So it's a funny coincidence, but it's my feeling that that's the origin of all the myths and stories about werewolves and vampires. But there are other animals that carry rabies. There are many animals, raccoons, skunks, foxes, among others. So I think wolves have had a bad rap, which they don't really deserve. Because they are actually extremely social, loving animals, and when they're properly treated, they behave very well among their own families. This woman has befriended 2 wild wolves. It's not something she did overnight. She's taken time and trouble to actually get to know them. But now they consider her to be one of their pack. So now I'm going to talk about something very, very happy. And that's Yellowstone National Park. And you can see why it's called Yellowstone, because the basic geography is all this yellow limestone. And 90 years ago, wolves were eradicated from the park. They were wiped out. And the moment the wolves were gone, the deer began to multiply, and then the deer slowly wiped out all the vegetation. Now we are coming to understand a concept called a trophic cascade. And that is something where when something happens to a top predator animal in the food chain, that causes changes which cascade right down through all the other animals, down to the lowest animal in the food chain. So when wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone Park 20 years ago, something quite amazing happened. The first thing, of course, is that the wolves began to attack the deer. But it was just a small pack of wolves, and they only killed a few deer. So that didn't stop the destruction of the vegetation. Something else that happened was that as the wolves were predating on the deer began to avoid the wolves. Especially the areas where the wolves found it easy to trap the deer, which is all the ravines and gullies and the valley sides. And as a result, all those areas which were inhabited by the wolves and where the wolves would hunt became free of deer. The deer would have to hide. And all the vegetation in those areas began to regenerate. And within 6 years, massive trees had grown. There was alder and cottonwood and willow and aspen, all these native trees came back. And when the trees came back, so did the songbirds and the beavers. Now the beavers would cut down the trees and make their little beaver dams. Those would create ponds or mini lakes in the river, if you like. And that would invite all the otters and muskrat and ducks and then reptiles, snakes, lizards, turtles, frogs, you name it, all kinds of animals came back. But that's not all. Because the wolves also hunted and killed coyotes, the coyotes disappeared from the park. Now the coyotes used to predate on the rabbits and mice. So when the coyotes were gone, the rabbits and mice began to increase in numbers and they became prey animals for weasels. So the weasels came back, foxes came back, badgers came back, hawks and owls came back. And even eagles and ravens came back because they would feed on what was left behind, or the carrion from the wolf kills. Even bears began to increase in numbers because the vegetation that was saved by the wolves produced berries, which was food for the bears. So in this fashion, the wolves actually regenerated the entire ecosystem. But that's not all, and that's not even the most significant thing. The other thing which happened was that because now there was strong vegetation along the river banks and on the sides of the valleys, so all the soil was being held in place. There was no erosion anymore, and so the river could stay in its course. It wouldn't get diverted because of a landslide or a mudslide. And as a result, the rivers began to cut through that limestone and make deep gorges and waterfalls and pools of water, which provided all kinds of advantages for many animals in the park. And so, not only did the wolves actually regenerate the ecosystem of the Yellowstone National Park, but actually the geography of the park itself was responding and changing in response to the wolves. And all these reasons are why I say we need wolves. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation. Thank you and goodbye.